The myth of Ghosh's inner antique land is constructed upon a dichotomy between a somewhat idyllic medieval Middle East, reconstructed through fragments of an ancient archive, the Geneja, and the contemporary Middle East, which Ghosh encounters firsthand while conducting his doctoral research in Egypt. The fact that the world of the Cairo Geneja exhibited a significant degree of religious syncretism is of great interest to Ghosh. The most literal form of this syncretism, he suggests, may well be seen in the language of the Geneja documents themselves. While teasing out the history of the slave Boma's name, for instance, Ghosh is introduced to the existence of an obscure religious cult in Tulunat, the Bhutas, who worshipped a species of spirit deities known by the same name. Ghosh explains that ancient Tulunat contained shrines to both the various Bhutas and the Orthodox Hindu pantheon, but that most of the Tuluva people participated enthusiastically in the worship of both sets of deities. There was no contradiction in this, of course, for to them Bhutas and Sanskritic deities represented aspects of divine and supernatural power that shaded gently and imperceptibly into each other. The narrator's construction of Boma is clearly meant to disturb the colonial historical legacy. It creates a subaltern subject, a slave, who lived in the era before the European expansion and the appearance of colonialism, and its dividing epistemology of modernism. Further, Boma represents a world that was interconnected by trade in a manner quite far from the capital-dictated connections of Western modernism or globalization. Boma also represents an ethical call for syncretic connections between such geographical places, peoples, social classes, and religions that nowadays seem quite distinct as the outcome of the partitioning of the world after Western expansion. Further, the narrative is self-reflexively open about the way this subject is created through its meta-narrative of tracing the manuscripts that have been spread around the world. Inner Antique Land as a whole is an example of ethical solidarity between representational strategies as it combines several discourses into an unprecedented ethio-political whole. And the way Boma is narrated a historical trajectory of his own interwoven with that of Ben Yuju makes him appear quite organic and, for a want of better term, essentialized subject with an ethico-political meaning and purpose of his own. Boma as an essence is a token of the strategy to obtain control over processes of history along agential lines. As the narrator says in the book, Ben Yeju and his slave Boma are preserved as tiny threads woven into the borders of a gigantic tapestry. Page 95. They represent small agential lines in the borders of the processes of history. Throughout Ghosh's work, there is an interest in the nature of language and the ways in which it molds and determines our ways of comprehending and experiencing things. The notion of subject is constructed in representation through discursive connections with other people and the world. The identity that comes through in Ghosh's text is not then a solid and detached identity. Again, the subjects are not self-generated individual, detached observers of outside reality in the modernist state, but they exist only in close relationship and connection with others as active agents, instead of appearing as passive observers. Gayatri Chakrabarty's Vivek concludes that the subaltern subject would benefit from the use of strategic essentialism. The use positivist essentialism is a scrupulously visible political interest. Radhakrishan's recourse to A very significant episode of the text is where the modern faith of syncretism is put to test in the second visit of Amitabh in 1988 to his visit of the tomb of the Saint Sidi Abu Hasira, a Jew from the Maghreb who came to Egypt and converted to Islam and was recognized by the people as a man of extraordinary benevolent powers, a good man endowed with the blessing of Baraka. He got surprised to see a sleek concrete structure of a kind that one might expect to see in the newer and more expansive part of Alexandria and Cairo, in that poor quarter of Damanhur. It was not merely incongruous, its presence seemed an act of defiance. Page 333. Recognizing Ghosh as a foreigner, one of the officers demands an explanation for his visit to the tomb. The Maulid is already over, the tourists are all gone, and therefore the presence of a foreigner at the tomb is, according to the officer, itself a cause for suspicion. But what baffles the officer most is the fact that Ghosh is neither an Israeli devotee on a pilgrimage nor a follower of any of the monotheistic religions with which he is familiar. Neither Jewish nor Muslim nor Christian, there had to be something odd afoot. The potentially dangerous visitor is escorted to the local police station for further interrogation. This is, in this setting, to Ghosh reminiscent the colonial buildings built by the British in India, and probably a testimony to the British occupation of Egypt. The two men face each other across what Ghosh sees as the resolutely modern, all too contemporary, colonially implicated visions between peoples who once experienced a connected history. You are Indian. What connection would you have with the tomb of a Jewish holy man? Here is in Egypt? He is asked. He cannot find an immediate answer, but the book he will eventually write will attempt to provide one. Finding himself at a narrative impasse at the moment of the officer's questioning, Ghosh nevertheless shares the reader his sense of excitement at the survival of a popular religious syncretism of the past. It seemed uncanny that I have never known all those years that in defiance of the enforcers of history, a small remnant of Boma's world had survived not far from where I was living. So the quotations were actually from page 334 extending to 342. Hence, as a matter of strategy to gain control over processes of history along agential lines refers to the same thing. The identity of Boma is narratively built upon traces by the narrator, both practically, his search for the manuscript scraps, and theoretically, a post-structurally subject as a crossing point of texts. Radhakrishnan criticizes the postmodern essentialism narrative nexus for its polarity. It offers either essentialism or a mere subjectless process. What is missing in his view is the politics of representation. In the shadow lines, we get two views of nationalism and what it means to constitute a nation contest each other throughout the novel. One is voiced clearly by the narrator's grandmother, and the other takes the form of events that comment on this romantic view in more subtle ways. The narrator's grandmother upholds the belief in a united people fighting for freedom and autonomy and constituting a nation held together for blood. For her, someone like Ela, the product of a cosmopolitan education and hovering between India and London, is an enigma because she escapes categorization, and a traitor because she has brought freedom for the price of an air ticket. Page 87. She protects Ela has no right to live there. Everyone who lives here has earned his right to be there with blood. They know there is a nation because they have drawn their borders with blood. War is their religion. That's what it takes to make a country. Once that happens, people forget they were born this or that, Muslim or Hindu, Bengali or Punjab. They become a family born of the same pool of blood. That is what you have to achieve for India, don't you see? Page 76. Ela later calls this warmongering fascist ideology, but the narrator sees a pitiful side to this kind of thinking, a deep-seated bitterness at the yearning for middle-class values of unity of nationhood and self-respect and national power. Certainly, grandmother's thinking fails to take into account that what the British she is admiring did to India was an assertion of national power that an entirely other nation had to be the victim of. The narrator's view, however, is insightful in explaining people's need for the national myth and how the force of nationalism commands its appeal, although Ghosh, along the same line of argument made by Anderson, would be the first to reveal its shaky foundations. Most of the events taking place in the text questions and sometimes ridicules the concept of a nation. In his attempt to demystify this notion, the author begins with the idea of the national border. He puts forward the perspective that a border, supposedly uniting those who are inside it, as well as differentiating them from those who are other, in modern times divides more than unites. The author shows this in several instances, one of which is through the use of allegory, the partitioning of the grandmother's original home. This partition went through the house in an arbitrary manner, not making architectural sense, but making this absurdist claim of equality and fairness to both sides. For example, it went through a door, a chest of drawers, and their father's name plaque outside. This seems to be reminiscent of the Indian-Pakistan border, the outcome of the 1947 partition, which was relatively arbitrary, but laying the same claim to fairness is that the land was divided according to the majority religion in a particular administrative district. It is in reference to this boundary that the notion shadow lines is constructed to connote arbitrariness and artificiality. The author also reveals the futility of his partitioning in providing any real solution to the disputes, for he tells us they had longed for this division, but once it had actually happened, instead of peace they had so much looked forward to, they found that a strange eerie silence had descended on the house. It was never the same again. After that the life went out of it. Shadow Lines, page number 121. So the fact is that nationalism as a state ideology that claims to include all people, the ordinary folk, to celebrate diversity and speak for the entire imagined community, at the end pays so much attention to who is included in the communities that it fails to consider who are excluded and marginalized, such as women or lower classes, races or castes. The fraternity, which represents the nation, does not explicitly include them as equals. However, it always implicitly claims to represent them. Ranajit Guha's On Some Aspects of the Historiography of Colonial India, which announced a revisionist agenda for subaltern studies, volumes on Indian history, accused the dominant historiography of India, nationalism, for leaving out the subaltern classes and groups constituting the mass of the laboring population and the intermediate strata in town and country, that is people. He defined subaltern as the demographic difference between the local Indian population and all those we have defined as elite. The elite was composed of dominant groups, foreign as well as indigenous. The foreign, including British officials of the colonial state and foreign industrialists, merchants, financiers, planters, landlords and missionaries, and the indigenous divided into those who operated at the all India level, that is, the biggest feudal magnates, the most important representatives of the industrial and mercantile bourgeois, and the native recruits to the uppermost levels of the bureaucracy, and those who operated at the regional and local levels, either as members of the dominant All India groups or, if socially inferior, those who still acted in the interests of the latter and not in conformity to interests corresponding truly to their own being. So such a definition asks us to review colonial dichotomies. It shifts the crucial social divide from that between colonial and anti-colonial to that between elite and subaltern. Syncretism tends to facilitate coexistence and unity between otherwise different cultures and worldviews, a factor that has recommended it to rulers of multi-ethnic realms. Conversely, the rejection of syncretism, usually in the name of piety and orthodoxy, may help to generate bolster or authentic a sense of uncompromised cultural unity in a well-defined minority or majority. Religious syncretism exhibits blending of two or more religious belief systems into a new system, or the incorporation into a religious tradition of beliefs from unrelated traditions. This can occur for many reasons, and the latter scenario happens quite commonly in areas where multiple religious traditions exist in proximity and function actively in the culture, or when a culture is conquered and the conquerors bring their religious beliefs with them but do not succeed in entirely eradicating the old beliefs or especially practices. In modern secular society, religious innovators sometimes create new religions syncretically as a mechanism to reduce inter-religious tension and enmity, often with the effect of offending the original religions in question. Such religions, however, do remain some appeal to a less exclusive audience. Furthermore, the use of the word syncretism effaces not only the aspect of domination, but also the specific position from which certain interests are advanced, presumably in the name of a larger committee of universal brotherhood. Thus, one might say that syncretic formulations of cultural identity function as easily manipulable nationalist fictions which mask material realities of wealth, power, and class. And insomuch as Ghosh finds these syncretic strategies useful for questioning or dismantling modern nation and cultural partitions, his project clearly fails as a parodism of subversion and is shown to collude with the very logic which erects those boundaries in the first place. So one needs to be careful that this syncretic practice also doesn't fall in the same political criteria that the critics about nationalism objects. It doesn't emerge itself, it doesn't involve itself again in the political field that makes one nation dominant over the another. As a citizen of Bangladesh, we have faced war. We have got a map, we have got a flag, we have got a border. We are proud to be a Bengali, but it's still the national border that has given us security, that is supposed to give us security. Unfortunately, we are saying that it cannot give the proper security that it was supposed to give. Still in the border, many citizens of Bangladesh or many citizens of India are killed. So border, they can divide the area, but they really fail to stop the desire to meet the other, because desire originates and finds its object on the other. So it is really very impossible to stop mixing up people and having this mental bonding. So we have to be very careful about that, so that this nationalism, syncretism, these don't restrict our mental growth. Thank you for listening to me. If you have any comments, queries, please feel free to contact me through my mail. My mail address is shantiew@gmail.com or shantiew@ewbd.edu. Thank you for listening to me.